he looked through the scope of his rifle at it to get a closer view of it, and he said to the others, that's no human.
Welcome everyone, this is Daniel Allen Jones here, and I'm here with John Worms. Good to be here with you, John.
Good to be here.
So we're at the Mount Blanco Fossil Museum, run by Joe Taylor. We just got done having the They Are Real conference, and it's been quite an extraordinary last few days, and we've covered a lot of very interesting topics ranging from strange creatures to mystery lights to Mothman to UFOs to Bigfoot and all kinds of anomalous phenomena. So it's been pretty fascinating, and today we're very fortunate to have John here all the way from Canada to tell about some of the work he's been doing up where you're from. So John, where have you been coming out of, and tell us a little bit about the area up there in Canada where you're from.
Well, I'm right in the middle of Canada, in Manitoba, and I live in not exactly the south of Manitoba, but more north central, and so I'm about 4 hours north of the U.S. border, and I'm surrounded by lakes and boreal forest, which is immediately to the north, and the Canadian Shield. So I'm in the ideal location for the unknown things that I wasn't aware of when I moved there in 1972. But I went there to teach on a native reservation, and north of us, accessible by some roads, but many reservations are accessible only by winter roads on the ice or by air, and so the northern part is all these people that I discovered at some point about 20 years ago that had all kinds of stories of unknown, unusual animals, and it intrigued me, and I had the right kind of job that took me and paid me to travel throughout the north, especially, and so I just recorded, on paper and in a book, the stories that people gave me, and I would say 95% of the stories are from the native people who live in the wilderness by the lakes and rivers, and are familiar with these creatures to some extent. Some, very from personal encounters, or by family members, ancestors, and so it's just a mine of information. I could go out any day of the year into various reservations and talk to people that have seen something that science is not aware of.
So that's pretty incredible, and you've chronicled a lot of these different experiences and witnesses that people have had all throughout the region, and where it's very frigid and cold, and like you said, many lakes that you probably have traveled through to be able to get to some of these remote places. What has your process been like meeting with some of these people and going to these locations out in the field?
Well, when I started off and decided to test the north, because my first story that got me interested in this whole topic was right where I lived. This rumor that a lady on a reservation about 50 miles away had seen this huge, large snake, and so it was practically southern Manitoba, and so that kind of intrigued me. How is that possible? I mean, I grew up with garter snakes in southern Manitoba, and I had them where I lived now. So I wondered, what is this all about? So I decided one day to travel up to see her, and she told me her simple story that she was driving home on the paved road in the reservation on her way back from the city, which is, almost a 3-hour drive. And here in the middle of the road was this log that she had to slow down for and drive around. And as she drove around it, it moved, and she realized it wasn't a log, it was a big snake.
Wow.
And so I got it directly from her story of her experience. And then she referred me to other people from the same community that she had heard that had experiences seeing big snakes here or there. And so that's, the ball just kept rolling from there on. I went back home where we're separated by wilderness and water, and I thought, if they have snakes over there, why haven't I heard about them? Why don't we have them where I live? And as soon as I started asking some of the people, the stories kept coming out of my backyard community.
That's great. So you've put a lot of those stories together in your book here, Strange Creatures Seldom Seen. And this has been a really fascinating book for me to look through, because here in Texas, we also have a lot of very strange creatures and sightings of things, again, as you said, which science doesn't really seem to acknowledge. And the more we look into it, they have a lot of these very odd qualities to them. So hopefully we can continue to shed light on some of these different mystery creatures and unknown animals. But I'm really interested in the work you've done, so let's just jump right into your book. Tell a little bit about the process of collecting these accounts and then compiling them into this work that you've done.
Well, very simply, I would go to a community to start with. The first person that I'd see walking on the road, I would ask, is there anyone in this community that you know of that has seen anything out of the ordinary? And from there on, they'd point me in one direction, and I'd get that person's story. They'd tell me about 2 or 3 other people, and right away I'd have more than I could handle, and I'd have to make another trip, later that year or another year, and I could be going every day of the week and get more stories. But after about a dozen years of combing the north on a fairly regular basis, or even less than that to start with, now it's more follow up and getting anything else, any new stories. There was just more than one person could ever keep up with. There's just more stories, more experiences of every type. Even UFOs, some of these trappers that have been in the backwoods want to tell me their UFO sightings when they were in the wilderness, which I'm not really into, but I listened and recorded some. But I enjoy the creatures that I had never heard of before. Sasquatch even, I put on the back burner. I wasn't even going to treat it in my book because of other books that had been written about them. And these were the same creatures and the same habits and the same characteristics. And people wanted to tell me their Sasquatch stories. So rather than disappoint them, I took note of them, and I realized, hey, some of these are fantastically dramatic. And I thought, I sure can't leave that out. And in the end, it became one of my biggest chapters, and actually a creature that I just have almost developed a kinship toward, because they're so predictable and so human-like in their temperaments or habits. They're predictable somewhat. But my favorite actually really is the giant beaver, which I have seen myself.
Well, speaking of, we'll just get right in and touch upon a lot of these different creatures that you've chronicled in your book here. Tell us a little bit about that giant beaver.
Well, that is kind of a long, devious route that I took to get to the conclusions that I'm aware of now about the giant beaver. But to put it briefly, the first time I went to this one community, native community in northern Manitoba, the first time I went there, I talked to this elderly gentleman, and I said, "Do you have any unusual creatures around here?" And the first thing he says was, "We've got big beavers." So I said, "How big?" "Like black bears." I'd never heard of these before. And so then I asked, "Well, how big are their houses?" And I knew right away that wasn't a valid question, because if their houses were 10 times bigger than ordinary beaver, just like they are 10 times bigger than the average beaver, we'd know about them. It would be so obvious. And he replied, "Our elders tell us excuse me, that they live in burrows in sandy banks."
Wow.
And then the stories that I had heard from farmers in southern Manitoba about digging into their backyard hillside to make room for a building, and the grader falling into a burrow that was about 3 feet in diameter, elliptical in shape, with a smooth surface like a tabletop. Then those stories started to match what I heard in the north, and between the two, I got to figure out where these creatures live, which no scientific article has ever mentioned that they live in burrows. They just assume that they live like other beavers, although they do know that they did not cut down trees much, because their teeth were not sharp like an ordinary beaver's, suited for cutting trees, but they do on occasion anyway. But yes, so I was able to kind of put together a composite of their habits, their residences, and the only thing that I haven't found out about them yet is why they make such long burrows, such a great distance from the water where they begin, and what on earth they eat. None of the natives have given me any idea of exactly what they would eat, because there is, in some of these places where I saw mine, there was no vegetation in that river, and of course they don't come on shore very often at all. Like one Indian man said to me, he said, "We don't see them very often." and so anyway, there are a lot of questions to be answered, but because I have seen one right where I was told the elders had talked of seeing them, in this particular river in southern Manitoba. That's where I started. And because I'm in the U.S. right now, on that same reservation was a gentleman whose ancestors had not that long ago lived beside the Missouri River before the Custer incident helped them to flee north into Canada and settle where they are now. This gentleman said that on the shore of the Missouri River is where some of their people long ago had trouble with some animal disturbing their fish traps, which would have been just little pools made of stones or wood to trap fish so they could catch them easier. So they decided to stay up one night and see what was bothering their traps. And here they had killed this giant beaver. So they're living in the States as we speak. They're living in Canada. They're not an extinct or endangered species, I'm sure, although they will be put on that list as soon as they're deemed to be in existence. But the size, they're known by science. Like there have been enough fossils, or not fossils, enough bones of them found all the way from Alaska to Florida that they know that they lived in between those areas. And in the Beringia Museum in the Yukon, the White Horse, Yukon, is a replica of the giant beaver. And I had the chance of standing beside one on their museum grounds. And so they are known by science to be about the size of a good medium-sized black bear, up to 400, 450 pounds.
Oh, well, that's really fascinating. It's a really interesting account that you've been able to go and track down and maybe even see for yourself. So, and then also in Manitoba, you also have what's called the Manipogo. If you could tell a little bit about that creature as well.
Okay, Loch Ness has its Nessie. Ogopogo Lake in British Columbia has its Ogopogo, or some lake. I'm not sure what the name of the lake was, but Okanagan Lake, I think it is, Ogopogo. And then in Manitoba, about in the middle of the last century, there were so many sightings of creatures, large creatures mostly, in Lake Manitoba, which is half a mile from my house, that people started referring to those creatures that were seen as the Manipogo. Okay, so that name is an umbrella for probably a dozen of different creatures that are seen and not known. So the Manipogo, in my chapter, there's at least half a dozen that stand out among others. Like, the big snake is in a chapter of its own. It lives there as well, so it could be considered one of the Manipogos. And the giant beaver lives in that lake in certain places as well. And so it should be in the Manipogo chapter, but it isn't. But yes, so yes, speaking of Manipogo, yes, these I don't know too much about these type of creatures, but I know that there are plesiosaurs that are, have four flippers, and there's the short neck plesiosaur and the long neck plesiosaur. So this with a long neck was described to me by a gentleman who lives beside Lake Manitoba, the same lake that I live beside, only maybe 75 miles further north, but in the same lake. And he saw its long neck sticking out of the water 3 times in a row, just minutes apart, as if it moved from there, stuck its neck up, and then went down, and then over there again, and over there again. And before they sat and looked at the lake to see that, their children had been swimming at a little beach, and the mother of some of the children had seen something just behind them in the water, something fairly big, and immediately she screamed for the children to come out of the water. So this gentleman that was with her, who was her uncle, he knew right away because what was probably going on, because he had an encounter when he was taking a bath in the lake after work one day, and this creature that he had seen in a distance, after he washed the shampoo out of his hair, and he looked back over there, and here it was coming toward him full speed, and he started swimming to shore. He said, "I could have outdone any what do you call them?
Like an Olympic swimmer or something." Yeah.
Yes. And he didn't stop until his fingers touched the sand. He ran to his car, expecting to be grabbed from behind.
Wow.
So he already knew what was in the lake.
Yeah.
And so when his niece shouted at the children to come out of the water, he knew what it was all about.
Wow.
So as he sat there, he saw this long-necked plesiosaur do this. And this one, and I know another person, a native person. This is not a native. The other person that saw the same type of creature in the same lake was from the reservation where I live right beside, and she had seen it in that lake, when she was a girl as well.
So several people have actually seen this. It's not just one
Right.
or two people, but it's been a recurring thing happening.
Not that frequently, from what I understand, in that big lake, Lake Manitoba. But in the lake that's on the other side of me, the one is half a mile away, Lake Manitoba. The other lake is about 3 miles away. And that one, different people have seen that creature when they've been, especially night lighting, with spotlights, looking for moose and deer after dark. And different ones have told me that in the middle of the lake, all of a sudden, when they sweep their spotlight, they'll see something like this with not a terribly long neck, so it must be more this type. And then the body, part of the body, they seem to, at night, after dark, they seem to like to surface. And they become buoyant in some fashion, and they can even see part of their body, as well as the neck and head. And so that has been reported, by a number of hunting groups. And then just a year ago, I was told by a fellow that I know from the same reservation about his experience with a cousin where this type of creature had pulled itself with its flippers up on a big rock and was reaching toward the leaves.
Incredible.
And his cousin, the driver, wanted him to shut the light off. He was too scared. But he turned it back on, and the next picture, looking right at them, and being artistic, draw them for me, like years later now. And so in that lake, which is about 30 miles long, my backyard, both of them are in my backyard, basically, I have these creatures that are thought to be extinct for millions and millions of years.
Of course, and yet they're right there, and people have been seeing them. And so it really makes one wonder, what does this mean for us? Have these creatures been here the whole time? Are there more? Is this a small population? There are a lot of questions that I think come up whenever someone experiences something like this. So it's very interesting, and I'm glad that they were able to render that artistic picture there for us to be able to see what they saw. It's very interesting. And as we continue along, I know we could spend all day talking on this one, or all of these really, but you have included Sasquatch in your book as well. So tell us a little bit about some of the accounts that you've come across, including Sasquatch, or what some people call Bigfoot.
Well, in case I forget, I'll start with the most recent one. A little over a month ago, just before, just a few weeks before I came to this conference, I had the chance of speaking with a young man who had been out beside the river, a major river that drains Lake Manitoba into Lake Winnipeg. He had two small boys, like almost 3 years old and almost 5 years old, playing in the water. One was throwing stones. The older son paused with the stone in his hand. The stone fell out of his hand, and then he said, "Who's that hairy man that's looking at us?" And so they all turned to look across the river, and here was this typical, about 8 foot tall, huge, hairy creature on two legs, standing and looking at them. And they just stared at each other. And their dog that had come with them just happened to come out of the grass at that moment, saw this tense situation, saw the creature across the river, and started barking furiously with the hair on its neck standing up.
Yeah.
And as it was barking at that creature over there, the father and two sons, they took off to get on their quad to get out of there. And during that time, this creature, in response to the dog's barking, did its own loud noise. And it was, I got the dad to try to give me that sound, and it was just a very deep, loud, very loud type of thing, just a massive though. And from 150 yards is about how wide the river was. 100, 150. He said he could feel that sound as it hit his chest.
Wow.
It was that strong a sound. And 3 times it made that sound as they were getting on their machine and getting out of there. So that was a little over a month ago.
Wow. So this is something that, of course, a lot of people who are interested in Bigfoot, Sasquatch, they know that it's been happening for some time, but even up until recently, there's still things going on. There are still things people are seeing, and not just over in the Pacific Northwest in Washington and Oregon, but up in Canada as well, apparently. And this is something that perhaps the natives have been aware of for some time. Have you come across any different accounts or people who have had stories like that?
Well, like I said, when I went into the north, I was going to leave the Sasquatch stories alone. But because Sasquatch seemed to be known in practically every community, had its sightings and people that had had encounters, and they wanted to tell me. So it seemed like they were all over.
Wow.
And there's all kinds of theories. Even some native people have suggested that they have a mystical side to them because things just don't always add up. But the the man that really got me into Sasquatch was a neighbor who would keep coming and almost like bothering me with his stories when I was trying to get some work done in the campground. He'd want to come and talk almost every week in summer. He was collecting stories from anyone in the province that had encounters, and in the coffee shops, that's all he wanted to talk about. And nobody knew why he was so obsessed with this topic. He was a very intelligent, prosperous farmer. And then finally, in his old age, he threw caution to the wind, I guess, and decided he was going to tell what happened to him. And so at the age of 17, and the family was they were new immigrants somewhat. This was during the wartime, 1941. This happened, and so he went out hunting as a 17-year-old with some older relatives, and he thought he had wounded. Well, he wounded a moose. He went hunting in his own area, kind of, and so he was tracking this moose that he wounded, and then through the willows at some point, about half an hour later, he saw this brown shape, which he assumed, being a moose, would have to be the rear end of the moose, which he hated to aim at.
Sure, yeah.
But he thought, this is maybe my only chance, so he fired right there. And a few minutes later, as he cautiously approached the kill, here's what he saw.
Wow.
And I had an artist friend that was able to reconstruct this, to his satisfaction, what it looked like, and he showed us the position it was lying in when he found it, and it was stone dead. So he hit it right either in the spine or in the heart or both. And so one shot with a deer rifle, a moose rifle, brought him down. And he had no idea what it was. He had only heard of the wild men or the bushmen in the Caucasus Mountains of Europe. And so he didn't even tell his hunting partners. This was wartime. He could be in trouble if he caused any trouble for his family.
Sure.
And anyway, so he kept it practically a secret for 30, 40, 50 years.
Wow.
And then finally he came out with it, and that explained why he was so obsessed with all kinds of Sasquatch stories.
Yeah.
So because of his steady research into the stories about it all over the country, I was able to kind of gain an appreciation and background of what was known or what was happening where. And then when I went into the north and around the province among the native people, that just built on what I had already heard from him.
That's great. Well, and as we said, we could spend all day talking about this specific area of Sasquatch. And of course, it's not just an isolated phenomenon. It seems like it's everywhere in the world something like this is happening. There are accounts and stories of different cultures having these hairy and wild men. And so it's a very fascinating topic. I think it's well worth looking into. And it's just an amazing part to have included in your work. And continuing along, I think it's well worth to mention that you have a number of different areas and that you cover, and not just Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but all of these different creatures. And so we're going to continue along and look at some of the large flying creatures, some of the big birds and things like that that you have that you've shared about. And we've got a whole lot that we could, of course, get into. We'll try to touch as many as we can. So tell us a little bit about some of the large aerial and avian type creatures that you came across in your stories with people.
Well, I can't even remember just where it started, but one of my earliest accounts was from an isolated reservation that I went to this past winter on the crossing about half a dozen lakes, and in that community, people were talking about big birds, and they referred me to this white man that had been married to one of the native ladies from there, and that he had an experience years ago in the 70s. So I made contact with him, and actually his drawing, he sent me a drawing. I never met him for years, but he sent me a sketch of what he saw, and it was like just an overgrown bat. And he said, and this was after dark, these are nocturnal creatures. Like there's big birds the same size with feathers, but then there's these without feathers that look more like bats that are strictly nocturnal and are only seen in bright moonlight. And anyway, he had stopped his snowmobile on a portage and checked his load, and happened to look up, and here was this, what he thought was an airplane, approaching, and nothing, no flapping of wings or anything, just soaring, and it went right above him, just above the trees. He said, I could have thrown a ball and hit it. Wow. And so he got a good look at it, even the color of the claws, and just like an overgrown bat, the size of a Piper Cub airplane, he said.
That's incredible.
So about a 30-foot wingspan and about a 25-foot fuselage, I think they call it. Yeah, he said it could have just picked him up like that. And then I started hearing stories of moose hunters following moose tracks in the snow, and then when you come to a clearing, all of a sudden the moose tracks stop. Well, some were daring enough to say that this creature, these flying bats, are big enough to pick up a moose, take it home, and feed it to their family in front of their cave.
Wow.
And this is what I've been doing for a while, trying to get to some of these caves. They're very inaccessible, to say the least, but they're known to some people, a few people, who don't really want to go inside, because one man tried, and as soon as he entered, there was this loud sound that scared him, and he took off.
I imagine.
And I'm almost positive that that's where these nocturnal bat-like creatures stay during the day, and when they're not out flying in the dark looking for animals or possibly people, as some have suggested, to take home the food. So
that's pretty incredible. And that's something that we also see here in South Texas, the tales of the thunderbird or the big bird in things like that. And so we could be seeing a relation there. Continuing along, you have something in your book called the Beaver Duck. So could you explain a little bit about what that is?
Okay, just before I came, I was hoping to have gone out into this little lake with a native man where he was going to show me exactly where he shot at this creature when he was a boy, out hunting ducks, whatever, with his 22. and we couldn't connect on getting to go out there. Maybe after I get back, if the snow disappears that we got overnight, we may still be able to go out in the canoe and he can show me where, and I'm hoping you're still living there. But he told me that as he was crawling around along in the grass, thinking he was sneaking up on some ducks, he saw these about 3 of these creatures that were about the size of a beaver, and and they had beaks. They were beaver-like in shape somewhat, but with a big beak out front. And he remembers the bigger one standing on a bit of a bank, and when it was standing there, going something like this with its smaller front feet, that's when one of the others would slide down like an otter, slide down the little bank into the water. And he hadn't mentioned that previously. I thought that was kind of interesting. So, and I hear of that creature in certain places in the north, actually in quite a few places, but it's not very well known. Not too many people have run into it. But one man saw it coming down the highway, not a busy highway, and he said it was just walking on the side of the road towards his vehicle, just like a beaver would. And he said, I looked at it, and he also, described the beak on it. And he said, I thought, well, I guess they live around here too. But that's rare. But I'm hoping to find them soon.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Sounds like it could be similar to a platypus or something like that, perhaps.
Yeah, those who know about platypuses call them that.
Oh, okay.
In fact, the first person that told me about them, he said, you should go and see Cecil Hart. He and his wife saw a platypus when they were in a canoe.
Huh.
I thought, platypus? That doesn't add up. I wasn't even going to bother with that. Until someone else, a few minutes later, said, you should go and see Cecil Hart, see a platypus.
Huh.
And I thought, okay, I'll go. And sure enough, this is what they saw. They heard it splash behind them when it, jumped off the shore, I guess. And then all of a sudden, here they see this thing swimming under their canoe, and they can see the shape and the beak on it.
And there it is.
So they live in Manitoba.
Well, that's really interesting. Maybe we'll be able to see a few more of those and get an idea about what we could be dealing with. And that seems really interesting. So continuing along, you also write about some reptiles like crocodiles and lizards. What are some of the ones that you've come across so far in your accounts?
Well, not a great number, but just enough to make it obvious that in northern Manitoba, where the ice gets from 3 to 4 to 5 feet thick in winter, and we drive on the lakes and rivers with our big semi-trucks hauling freight, we have not only big snakes mentioned and seen. I know a lady who saw one. She shot at it with her 22 from her canoe, just because I guess she was so scared that about a 20 long stovepipe-sized snake,
Wow.
which is a common size, in the lake beside me.
Okay.
Okay. In the north, where it gets that cold for a longer season than it gets cold, let's say even where I live in southern Manitoba, that's where people talk about, mostly the older generation, about coming across crocodiles or creatures that they would describe as crocodiles after they got to see pictures of them in books and that. And so definitely like an alligator or crocodile, with a long mouth, In fact, one fellow even found a skull of one, which some American got from him and never returned, who happened to be in the area at the time. Anyway, so they are known to be there, and some of them apparently were huge, and some of them were even known to give off a fiery substance.
Wow.
And eyes that glowed in the dark. And this one hunter, I know, I know the daughter, and he had been terrified of it. Just around dusk, it had come to his camp, and he had shot it, and it was large, and they came back the next day to burn it.
Oh, wow.
This is a typical thing that the native people like to do when there's something they are very much afraid of. They like to get rid of it completely.
Interesting.
So there are stories of various sizes of lizards and crocodiles and things like that, even in the not far north, but northern Manitoba.
It's fascinating. And you also write about another very interesting case of what you describe as an underwater moose. Tell us a little bit about that.
This one really doesn't make much sense, but I had the antlers for a number of years to prove it. They were saved for me by the couple that killed it when they were out commercial fishing one fall, and it was an animal that I've been told about by a large number of people over the years, because and the unique thing that they all included that they wanted to tell me about was, if you shoot at them, you're wasting your bullets. And elders even told their sons, don't bother, you're just going to waste your bullets, because they don't penetrate. The hide is so thick and the fat is so thick because they live underwater, winter and summer. And only occasionally are they seen on shore. So the general scenario is that hunters seeing this creature on shore tend to want to shoot at it. I know even one woman that did that because her husband was away, and her son saw her shoot many shots at it.
Oh, yeah.
And didn't bring it down.
Wow.
Anyway, so they shoot at it again and again and again. They see the bullets hit, see a little bit of blood, and they all say the same thing about they're caked with sand because they lie on the bottom of the lakes and rivers.
Very interesting.
And I just read to the group yesterday an account that I just got from a man who maybe close to 100 years ago visited these same areas in northern Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and met a man from another native community that I know about that had seen one through the thin ice, first ice in fall, and all of a sudden there below him in fairly deep water, he saw this moose walking, browsing on the bottom, eating, and so it doesn't make sense. A moose living 99.9% of its time underwater. But one man whose grandson told me this story said his grandfather, who traveled with dog teams long distances, came across this moose-like animal, and this was in the middle of winter, very cold, and so he killed it. And when he was skinning it, turned it over, he realized that it has short legs. This wasn't like an ordinary moose at all, just the opposite. A big body like a bull. And anyway, he made the observation when he was skinning it, and in the picture here you can see below the chin of the moose head is a big mass of hair. Hair, they use the word folds or scarf. It's a thick mass of something. And that old man had said that he suspected that because that's such a unique component of this animal that he surmised that maybe that's a mechanism like gills on a fish that could give them their source of oxygen
Wow.
when they're underwater 99.9% of their lives.
That's really fascinating.
So, and these antlers I hope to get back from the government, which took them somewhat illegally, and there's a bit of a legal battle on now.
Well, hope that they get that back to you, because that seems like a find of a lifetime to really uncover an underwater moose, a creature that has always been thought to just be on the land and maybe just get in the water a little bit, perhaps. But to stay underwater for that long of a time, and those temperatures, and it just seems very bizarre. But that's a pretty incredible, creature.
Yeah.
We
So
can get
obviously, totally different from the ordinary moose because of its ability to stay underwater, and its totally different anatomy.
Sure.
Short legs and a hanging belly compared to the long legs of an ordinary moose, and skinniness. This thing is, when they got this to shore after they killed it, they had to round up their friends who were out camping as they were commercial fishing, and there were 14 of them, and it was all that the 14 people could do to pull and push this massive animal onto shore from in the water.
Wow.
Whereas an ordinary moose, 2 or 3 people can pull it ashore and skin it.
So it weighs a lot more, perhaps.
A lot
as well. Very interesting. You also wrote about sea dogs. So what are those like?
Okay, that's along the line of the the platypus. There aren't that many accounts, but I hear the odd account in the north about these dog-like creatures that most people never saw, but they would see their tracks in the sand on the shore in the daytime, which would have been made during the night, and one man even tried to set up some traps to try to catch one, and the next day the traps were all sprung, broken, whatever. So it must be a very powerful animal. And so hearing these stories in the north, I just assumed that was a creature that had a footprint like a dog that lived way up there. And then I heard 2 accounts, I think it was the same year, same summer, from my area, right where I live, one in the lake where all these creatures are, and the other one in the other lake that's on the other side of me, and one from a farmer's wife, a non-native lady, who went to the boat that her sons had used to catch some fish in summer, and left her the junk fish to feed to the chickens. So she went to the boat to get some of these to cook up for the chickens. And here, when she gets right close to the boat, out jumps this sort of dog-like animal, but doesn't have a neck that goes up like a dog. It's more like a mink, that's just kind of straight out, and about her weight, around 150 pounds. Well, quite a long animal, but short legs, and very powerful looking, and obviously a wild animal, she said. And here it jumped out of the boat and into the water, and then stayed around, and she walked along the shore, endangering herself, which her husband had said, that thing could have just torn you to pieces.
Oh, sure.
So easily, being that size. But so I got her story of it. She saw the whole thing. I got my artist to sketch it to her satisfaction, and it was beige in color, something like your slacks. And then a few months later, from a native man, he mentioned the same type of color animal that had jumped at his brother's hand over the side of the boat as they were traveling in Lake St. Martin. And because of the movement of the boat, he misjudged and didn't get his brother's arm.
Oh, wow.
And the mother quickly dragged him back.
How close.
And same color, had to be the same animal. What else, would live in underwater?
Yeah. It's very,
so many mysteries.
very strange.
How they live underwater, how they survive. What does the giant beaver eat when it makes burrows a mile long? More burrows, branches of burrows. There's so many questions. I just love to have professionals of all kind to get together and help figure all these things out and let people enjoy the secrets that creation is holding.
Yeah, it seems like it's been here the whole time, and I think it would be great to get a little bit more perspective on these things. We've got a few more we'll run through. And speaking of aquatic type creatures, you write on whales as well. So, what are the whales like out in that area?
Well, the whales, we'll call them whales because they look like them. Most people, when they tell me what they saw, the typical description is, I was driving along in my boat, and there was this reef. A reef is something that just sticks out of the water a little bit, and it was in deep water though, where I'd gone before. There shouldn't be a reef there now, and it was usually shaped like an overturned canoe or an overturned boat, so kind of this rounded shape. And so they would slow down, and as they were watching, it would just slowly go down. That's the typical story. The odd story, there's one that's kind of interesting.
That's what we like, yeah.
Where the boat was going along and hit one of these things and got stuck on there. And I guess the people didn't really know what it was, but a lady in the boat that needed to go to the bathroom badly, she thought this was the ideal opportunity. But I don't know where the story went from there, but I can only imagine that there was a struggle, as this creature would have invariably gone down fairly soon.
Oh, yeah.
Missed opportunity.
That's great. Well, it seems like there's quite a bit of interesting aquatic type creatures, and you also write on big frogs as well. So there are some amphibious things out there, and you've heard accounts about big frogs. So what's that like?
Well, the typical ones that I first heard about were, from a variety of communities, and they were said to be about the size of a beaver.
Wow.
And a variety of colors. Some were brown, some were almost golden in their glistening color, and so that was what I became familiar with. And then people started to tell me what they saw when they were, going over some of these rocky hills, and one hunter apparently, put his gun against a boulder, and he realized this is not a boulder. So this was not the typical frog that we just talked about. This was almost like a giant toad.
Wow.
More the toad-like rounded.
Yeah.
And so it appeared like a boulder to set your gun against, and it moved, and its eyes moved, and they realized what was there, and so they quickly got out of it.
How interesting.
A number of stories like that I've heard.
That's great. So kind of switching gears a little bit, you also have a chapter on dry rats. So what are the dry rats?
Okay, that's not something that's that well known in as many areas as some of the other animals. But I've had different accounts where people would tell me, like one lady said, I had a muskrat. Are you familiar with muskrats in Texas?
Sure, yeah. Well, we have a variety of different farming type creatures, and that kind of ends up falling into that category somewhat.
Okay, so a muskrat is, like an overgrown rat with a long tail, and the native people especially have trapped them for years and years and made, good money trapping them. So they can become kind of aggressive when they're caught in a trap, and you confront them. But these, I was kind of given the understanding that these are almost a special breed. I don't know if it's it's just the nature that's different, or whether there's different difference physically from the ordinary muskrats. But these don't seem to live in these little muskrat houses that you see. You're familiar with them? Muskrat house?
Sure.
Made of reeds?
Yeah.
Okay. These live in kind of in holes in a kind of a swampy area that doesn't have water in it. You know, kind of a dry swamp. Okay, maybe that's why they call them dry rats.
Oh, okay.
And okay, so one typical story was this man comes walking along, and he's crossing one of these swamps, and he sees caribou bones. See, there's a lot of caribou up north, and he sees caribou bones, and all of a sudden he sees some of these creatures come out of their holes and start chasing him. And he runs for his life because he's probably heard of these creatures, and he's seen the caribou bones around, and he doesn't want to add to those bones.
Sure.
So he goes for all he's worth. And this lady, like I mentioned, she said she had the experience of a muskrat, some type of muskrat, jump up right toward her neck, and she just, you know, shoved it off. But apparently they go for the neck.
Wow.
And so they could bring a human down probably fairly quickly by getting, you know, the jugular or whatever.
Yeah.
And this is their tendency. So whether it's just a behavioral issue.
Yeah, that's a pretty frightening thought to be taken down by a little muskrat type creature, you know.
Yeah.
So that's a really fascinating array of different creatures, and we'll end on one more that I think after looking at all of these different fascinating possibilities, it almost seems like why not just go ahead and go this way? You write on mare beings like merfolk or perhaps mermaid type creatures. This is kind of what you're hinting at in this final area of your writing.
My brother said to me, if you had left that chapter out, your book would have been okay.
Well, see, I think when we're talking about underwater moose and all of these other very fantastical
other
beings, why not just go ahead and throw it in there, right? So how is that like including that in the book? That's a fairly people often throw that out there immediately, but what has your experience been with stories of that nature?
People have been fairly nice to me about avoiding discussing that.
Sure, understandably so.
But I had to include it, just like I felt I had to include the little people, because everybody in the different communities wanted to tell me their little people stories. And I didn't want anything to do with that because I knew it was of a spiritual nature. And I wanted to stay with strictly animals. Okay? I didn't know what to think. But I heard about them mentioned, told about different people that had seen one or more in such a variety of communities, even in my home community. Somebody mentioned just this summer about somebody they knew that in the marsh right behind our place, somebody was fishing and they got something, and I guess it got away, and all they had left on their fish hook was some strands of red hair.
Wow.
Well, what lives in the waters that's got long red hair? And I have heard other accounts of people throughout the north of seeing mermaids, not totally all mermaids, but most of them were female. And they'd all say, looks just like a white woman with blonde hair. And they all remark about how nice, how beautiful their long hair are. And usually they're blonde, a few are red. I think I heard of maybe one, black or dark, but mostly blonde. And the upper body, totally female features, and usually sitting on a rock among the rapids. Probably eat fish. And then when they see you, they'll the bottom part of them is fish-like.
So typical upper body human person,
just
and then
like
bottom
just like all the pictures.
Yeah, okay,
They've
wow.
been around for hundreds of years. Okay, and they'll dive in and be gone. Others have heard, something singing
Okay, wow.
and attribute that to these creatures. Um, yeah. So as crazy as this may sound, um, these are the stories I get. These are the stories I write about.
Well, we're writing and talking about strange creatures seldom seen, so why not just throw it in there anyways? I think you're already working in this area that most people are quick to ridicule, and I think it's important to note that it's okay to keep an open mind when we're dealing with this, because no one really would know exactly if there are or aren't mermaids, because or any of these fantastic creatures, just because when we're dealing with these, it's something that people experience and they might have seen at one point in their life and maybe never again. And so we like to be able to collect those stories and build these accounts in a way that provides more credibility, more validity to this field that we like to call cryptozoology or other unknown species. And I think it's something that you're doing a really great job on. John, I want to just say that it's been fascinating to hear all of these different tales that you've come across. You're a wealth of information and knowledge when it comes to these stories, and it's something that I think is really important to provide for people who are looking to learn more about what we're dealing with here, and in places all over the world as well. So, where can people go to find out more about your information, your book, and keep up with your work?
Well, at the moment, my book is available on Amazon. I haven't gone public in Canada yet because of the antler issue, but hopefully soon. Um, yeah, I have a web page, Strange Creatures Seldom Seen. That'll get you there. Don't have much on it, but a few of the pictures, and hopefully somebody will help develop it, better in the future. But yeah, so at the moment, for anyone, the book is available, and the web page, and yeah, I'm basically just a lone ranger doing this because I was able to in between my other work over the last 25 years. So I'm kind of looking around for help and the right organization to help house a platypus, a live platypus, or a mount of one, and make replicas of them for museums.
Sort of like what Joe Taylor does here at the
Exactly.
Mount Blanco Fossil
Exactly.
Museum.
I'm hoping that I can get the experience of this gentleman, in display in a place like this, somewhat in the near future.
Well, I think it would be great for people to be able to come and see what these encounters would have been like for those who are face to face with some of these creatures, which we're told don't exist or aren't acknowledged by science. And so, what would you say as a send off to people who are looking to further their understanding of what we're dealing with, or even are on the skeptical side and think, I don't believe any of this, or they just don't really know? What would you say to those people?
Well, a thought comes to mind. The saying is, seeing is believing. If I would have taken that literally, I wouldn't be here today and I wouldn't have got any of this. I happen to believe enough to go and check out what I heard. So now, because I believed the stories and the people that I was referred to here and there and everywhere, I got these stories that all corroborate. And so, to me, believing was seeing in the end that there had to be definitely some truth to all these stories. So check it out, check things out. What else? Yes, if you're looking for the truth of any nature, you're going to find it if you keep going looking for it. And Don't dismiss the people that say they have seen something, because it costs these people more to come out and go public with their stories than to just be quiet. They're hiding something traumatic in many cases that they would like to share with people. I've had people tell me, "You're the first person other than my husband that I told this to." They're scared to be laughed at, but they feel better when I tell them, "You know, I've heard a lot of these stories from other people." Really? Then they know they're not the only one that had this unique experience, and it's therapeutic for them. So, go out on a limb and listen to what may sound to be strange, and it maybe will be something that many other people have experienced, and many people that have had close encounters with Sasquatch or a big serpent right beside their boat have been ill for months. This lady, well, a year ago, right within a mile or so of my house in Lake Manitoba, saw a huge serpent that I even hate to mention because the dimensions of it were so extraordinary. I'd never heard of that monstrous size before. She was so traumatized by that every time I broached the subject with her, she just felt uncomfortable. She really didn't want to talk about it, but she knew me. I had been her teacher at some point. And so she told me her story, but I could see that she was just uncomfortable the whole time. Now, some people get physically sick. I must tell you this one. Speaking of the Sasquatch, which wasn't my favorite for the longest time, these young people go out in the middle of winter. We don't see Sasquatch tracks in winter, normally. That's an oddity. In the middle of winter, in January, the young people get into a truck, front and back, probably four or five young people. And they go back in the boonies where they can, barely drive in the snow, moose hunting. And they see this creature in the distance. And, it's upright, it's on two legs. And they think it must be a man that probably needs some help because he's in the middle of nowhere. And it keeps coming toward them. They keep driving toward it. And next thing they know, the man who told me, the boy, teenager who told me about it, he looked through the scope of his rifle at it to get a closer view of it. And he said to the others, that's no human. That's no human. It was a big, hairy, I think it was a female.
Oh, wow.
It's in my book.
Great.
Definitely in my book. But the unusual thing about this one is that it ran through the ditch effortlessly in the deep snow, stood behind a little tree, looked above it at them, and then as the girls in this vehicle were kind of going hysterical about this big creature being so close, it starts running toward them.
Wow.
And so the driver starts the engine and backs up the road because there's no place to turn around, narrow road. And so they back up for the half mile till where they can turn around. And the crazy part about this is that when I talked to the young man who looked at it through his scope and experienced this whole thing, and his cousin who was the driver of the truck, when I talked to them both and asked them how big the creature was, they said between 12 and 13 feet tall. And they had gone back the next day, not all of them, but some of them had gone back the next day to check it out, I guess, just to make sure that this had really happened. And they got out, and with their boots, winter boots, they stepped into its footprints. And he said, or how did it go? I asked him, like my footprint is about a foot long. So I put two of my feet together, approximately 2 feet. I said, was it that big? He said, no, another one.
Wow.
So a footprint that's close or 3 feet long would kind of match something that's 12 to 13 feet tall. Roughly.
It's incredible.
So in winter yet, I mean, that's right, this was a female, because I had made the comment about did the old man kick her out of the cave or wherever they happened to stay. I haven't found that out yet. And what was she doing on a cold day in the middle of winter?
Joe has a model of just about the same size of a humanoid figure, only the bottom half. We can only imagine that it would have been an enormous,
Yes,
very large creature, very incredible. And this is something that not a lot of people really buy into, but when you have people see this type of creature, it completely changes their whole life, their mindset, how they interact with people. And like you said, they when you are talking with them, they get emotional about that.
That's right. That's what I was going to mention. So the young man that I talked to just a couple of years after the incident, he might have still been in his teens. When I asked him how he felt about it, he said he wished he hadn't seen it.
Wow.
I said, wasn't it something special for you? He said, that's what my mom said. But he said, and the mother told me later, she said he kept saying he wished he had never seen it. He didn't eat or sleep for a week. He was so traumatized, is not quite an adequate word, I guess, but by this event that, and even years later when I talked to him again, he still said, I wish I hadn't seen it. It was just that surreal and traumatizing.
It's very powerful.
Powerful.
So these are incredible experiences when people have these encounters that can change their life forever. And we're thankful for someone like you, John, who goes around and connects with these people who have something to share, who are willing to put themselves on the line to be able to get this information out there. And so I want to thank you for coming all the way up from Canada to just be with us, to share your wealth of knowledge and information, and doing what we can to keep this legacy of understanding these mysterious creatures intact and to continue it along. So I want to invite everyone out to go check out John's book here, Strange Creatures Seldom Seen. You can order it on Amazon. Go to his website, strangecreatureseldomseen.com, and let him know what you think. There's some fascinating accounts in here, things that you've probably never even thought of, and you're doing some great work. So again, thank you for being here. And
I would like to give credit, big credit, to the Native people largely who have given me the bulk of these stories and put their reputations on the line. And even though their culture didn't really promote talking about unusual things, they dared to share this with me, and I appreciate that so much. Without their input, there would be very little knowledge that's now here for us to enjoy.
Exactly. So keep an open mind, be respectful and considerate of others' experiences and what they've encountered, and get out there and explore and see what we can discover so we can work together. So thanks for tuning in, and stay in touch. John, really appreciate you coming out. Thanks again.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for being here.
If you liked this video, be sure to check out our other content and get connected on our page and social media sites. Every day, new discoveries are being made all across the world and beyond, so let's work together to find out what's next. And remember, we won't know if we don't go. I'll see you in the Vortex.